Is this the real life, or is this just a fictional reality? Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me again on another episode of Fictional Reality. This week, I speak with Dr. Cameron Cliff, a immersive design experienced designer, a storyteller, a poet, an artiste, and just a generally great guy who recently had his eyes lasered when this episode was going on. Hence why his video is so dark. If you're listening on Spotify, you don't got to worry about it. But this week, I had a really excellent conversation with Cameron. He's a good friend of mine, as well as someone that I've worked with, and we've designed stuff together. And we really go nice and deep in how emotions and storytelling are connected, how storytelling and sort of interactivity and audience agency and control can really be sort of work together to facilitate emotional experiences. So when the audience feels like they have a sense of control, a sense of agency within the story that they are immersed in, then they will emotionally connect to the content. Of course, you have to have a strong storytelling basis underneath, and the actors involved in the immersive theater that Cameron has created have to be able to sort of bounce off the audience members to facilitate this emotional engagement. But you can create change, you can create really engaging immersive worlds that rely on an emotional connection to the work. So we go in deep to that. Cameron shares a lot of resources about a feminist approach to game design, which I think is absolutely fascinating, and I hope you enjoy. Let's get into it. Thank you.
Welcome, Cam. Thank you for being on another episode of Fictional Reality for season 2, where we talk to experienced designers such as yourself about what experiences are, how they're designed, and maybe some tips and tricks for what we can take away there. So thanks for coming on. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for having me, James. It's pretty fun to be here and to talk through all this sort of stuff. My name's Cam. I officially have a doctorate in experience design, focused towards the business strategy side of it, and in particular looking at stories online and how that blends with the real world. So a decade ago, that was called transmedia storytelling. That buzzword died, and I kind of moved on with it to focus on how do we get stories that transition between the online world and the real world, or blend multiple modes of storytelling together. So I guess if I was to define an experience, I would define it something along the lines of something that a person goes through that has been in some way designed for them with an outcome in mind.
Yeah, right. Designed for them in what sense? Do you want to elaborate on maybe the scope of what that means?
Yeah. So I wouldn't define, you can have an experience as defined by the user. So everything that happens to us is an experience. The experiences go together to make up stories. I had my eyes lasered a week ago. That was a moment of experiences that went together, which might be the laser hitting my eye, or me spending 2 days in a drug-fueled haze as I came to grips with the world again. But together they make up that story. But in this kind of context, I would define the experience as something that someone puts together, these series of moments, which are designed to engineer some sort of outcome for a user that may or may not be determined by them.
Right. So there's an intention behind the experience that the user goes through. That's, I guess, makes a lot of sense. What? So you have some background, I guess, or some experience, some good experience creating theater that is like user-driven, that's interactive, that's immersive. Tell us a little bit about some of the shows you've created that you have directly used your sort of doctorate and experience for.
Yeah, I mean, so my day job is in online learning at the moment, and before that was in kind of feature film world design and a bit of online world design. And to keep myself sane, I did a lot of theater design because I found that was the most tactile and responsive way of making things, showing them to people and figuring out things as I made them. I think my favorite 2 that I've done was a show called You've Already Begun, which was actually, I was a performer that was facilitated in that, and we designed our own parts of a world. And that was where people got led into this boat that I was in, this old antique boat that's been beached in a museum. And they kind of interacted with the ghost of this boy who was telling the story of becoming kind of agoraphobic and afraid of the outside world. And their role was to try and encourage him to interact with the outside world again. And that was very much a I didn't design the story. There was an outcome that was desired from it, which was to get people to interact with his story. But when you went into it, there was just a series of jars, and whatever jar that you picked up informed what part of the story you got told in what order, which then informed the type of narrative you ended up with. The other one being, I think, probably Dinopocalypse, which was described as Jurassic Park meets Manus Island. So if you're listening to this outside of Australia, Manus Island is probably one of the greatest tragedies that Australia has engineered, where it's a place that we send a lot of people that are trying to come to Australia in need. And in that experience, they are given a number instead of a name. They are then subject to unknown time, often above 5 years at the moment, and just held there with no kind of future. They're not really looked after that well. And I have been involved in some VR experiences that we crafted based on psychological notes and individual reports from people stuck there. And I wanted to create something that kind of brought that home to people here without being like, how terrible is our government for doing this thing?
Right.
So, because there's so many sides to this story. Like we had thousands of people going on boats coming to Australia because there was this perception overseas that they could get a salvation however that happened. And the government needed to do something about it. Unfortunately, they chose something that's been condemned by the United Nations as their approach. But there are many sides to that story.
Stop that.
Yeah,
maybe it would, but is it ever a good idea?
Yeah, that they came with the approach of like, well, we'll just make it worse to go to Australia than to not.
Yeah.
To give both air to both sides of that story, because the thing that most people come up when they go, that's a horrible solution, is that at the time when they came up with that solution, no one was coming up with a better one in their eyes. No one was saying, well, we could do this instead.
Yeah.
So I brought that to our shores and said, like, what happens if dinosaurs were living underneath an Australian city all the time, and then they came out and you were able to interact with them as people made up their decision of what to do with them.
Yeah, right.
And it was a choose your own adventure theatre narrative. You rock up, you get assigned with a person to start with, and then from there, your decisions inform what parts of the narrative you experience. And then at the end, you end up with a fixed ending. So the beginning and the end of the story were always the same, but what flavor that ending had, and actually some of the moments of the ending were informed by the choices of the audience.
And how much, if you can talk from the audience perspective, because you can't have like an unending tree of possibilities. Like you have to somehow have a finite order to how the show is ended. Can you elaborate a little bit on how it's user generated, but it's also how it sticks to your models so that you still maintain some control, but the audience also gets to feel like they are controlling the narrative? How did you design that?
Yeah. I mean, for full clarity, I steal everything that I do. So, like, when I was overseas in New York for a few months, I stole most of this stuff from You've Already Begun and Then She Fell, and these incredible immersive experiences that people have made over there, and just kind of going to them again and again until I was destitute and trying to understand how they made them. And the thing that I found about those was that it wasn't the kind of endless possibility of narrative, but the moments in which you were given to play with a character that was complete, where the performer was able to flex around an audience member,
right,
and then was able to give more meaning to the A or B choice that you were given at the end. And the other part of that I stole is from this theory that I came across when I was doing my PhD from a couple of people. Ivan Asquith is one of the main ones there, and he put forward this idea of perceived co-creation,
right,
rather than actual co-creation. So the idea that that your contribution is making something with someone is just as powerful as if you are genuinely creating something with someone.
Right.
So what was that most valuable to an audience member is not necessarily doing the thing, but feeling like they're doing the thing.
And I've noticed that a lot when I was monitoring escape rooms, and like one of the skills that you develop as a person who's giving someone hints is like, obviously, you know the answer, they're struggling with the puzzle, they want a hint. And if you can hint them in a way that basically like that makes them feel like they've come up with the answer themselves, but really you've gone, do you have the padlock? Yes. and this puzzle, has it given you 4 numbers? Yes. What might you do? And they go, put the numbers in the padlock. And, you just are sort of like handing it to them, but they're the ones that are sort of connecting the dots. They would take credit for that, for figuring that out, sort of thing. It's like, yeah, we got a hint, but I solved the puzzle. I figured out what to do. And it was presented to you in such a way that you wouldn't be able to not figure it out. But we found that was really important, and subtle difference in language and how to present that idea to people would be the difference between them. Like, they would not want to be given the answer, but they were happy to be given so much information that the answer was inevitable.
It's incredibly important to figure out. I think that's the 4th highest tier of audience engagement that Ask with details in his work is mastery. So it's the second most powerful thing that you can do with someone, according to his research, is to give someone a feeling of mastery over something, rather than giving them a feeling of social connection, which would be the tier down from that.
Right.
And depending upon individual people, they can be more powerful than the others. Some people are more driven by mastery than they are by social connection, the other way around. But both of them then tie into the kind of pointy end of the pyramid of why I like things, which is self-efficacy, which is what I'm being told affirms who I am and makes me feel stronger about myself as a human.
Wow. Okay. Which is a pretty powerful thing to play with when you're creating emotionally charged theater.
And dangerous as well.
Right. And you have to be careful, because this is, you've already begun. Sorry, what was the name of your show again? The In the Boat?
You've already begun. Yeah.
So with that show, the things that I heard from people who went and saw it, I missed it, unfortunately. But that it was extremely emotionally resonant with them. And they came out not just like, oh yeah, it made me cry, but they were saying, I was weeping coming out of that. Like, they were so connected to you. And that was in large part because you actually incorporated them into the narrative, or like you incorporated their reaction at least, into the narrative that you were telling. Is that right?
Yeah, that one, I think probably had larger narrative design than the show with 10 performers and lots of dinosaurs and makeup and stuff. Funnily enough, the boat one I basically designed as a giant onion cake of potential story.
Right.
And dependent upon the person's ability and what they gave me in the moment, would be how deep we would go.
Right.
Because of the safety of the story. So if at one point there's a narrative about both of his parents dying and being washed overboard. Now, if that person had a recent loss, they wouldn't be brought as deep into that narrative unless they asked to be brought there.
Right.
So, and there's also a lot of kind of sound and light and things that I would play with, which can be triggering to people with certain difficulties. And so I would receive a report from the people in the pre-show area by a text before the person came to my boat, which had, this person does or does not like to be touched. And this person consents to being touched or not being touched. This person has experienced some difficulties with PTSD, anxiety, depression that they have disclosed and would like us to be aware of before the show.
Right.
The little things that were optional for people if they wanted to, and they were given layers of story and books and notes while they waited for the previous performance to finish, that so they could disclose.
They would have filled out a questionnaire prior to the show, is that correct?
Almost a verbal questionnaire. We had a character in the waiting area who kind of made tea for everyone and sat them down and got them into the kind of like mindset in the spooky area, and would kind of just surface questions for them and say, hey, we've heard like that people from the boat which you're going to often come out with quite an emotional time. Is there anything you'd like us to make the kind of spirits aware of?
Interesting. Which has a dual... Oh, sorry, you go.
No, I was going to say that was a touch of Maya, who designed the whole experience, that I found I would not have thought of coming that much younger. And I'm really grateful that she put that in there.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting, because it has this twofold purpose. And the one, the overt purpose is obviously the safety of the guests. You don't want to trigger anyone. You don't want anyone to sort of go, I didn't want this. I didn't expect it. But also it seems to work as a bit of a primer as well. And can I see it just from what you're telling me as something that would set me up to go, oh, okay, I'm about to go into something that's emotional. I could be interacted with in a physical way, which just starts to prep you to be able to do that, I guess, when the time comes. Like, just before you go into a haunted house and someone says, look, this is really scary. How do you feel about heights? You go, oh shit, okay. All right, embrace myself for heights. So when the time comes, you have this like experience that you have let yourself be ready to go into, I guess.
There's a whole moment where if people chose really unluckily a certain selection of stories in the wrong order, they could end up with a story that started with parents being killed, had a middle of contemplative suicide, and then ended up with like, I don't know if I want to engage with the outside world story towards the end. And it just like started off sad, got worse, and then kind of leveled out at depressing.
Was anyone so unlucky?
I had two that picked the most depressing kind of timeline. Right. And I had little moments of brevity, to ease it.
Yeah, right.
But oh boy.
And look, from my experience in Shakespeare of all places, brevity actually can make that emotional impact and the punch even worse because you get these swings. And like if the whole thing is on a downer note, you can sort of you can fortitude against that. But if there's these nice little moments there, man, it can be difficult in the sense that you go literally on an emotional roller coaster.
And I had quite a risky part in there that everyone did, which was they gave me stimulus and I wrote them kind of poetry and interacted with them and gave them bits of story while I was writing this poetry to then sneak away and present to them towards the end.
Right.
And I was able to modify
them.
Yes, yeah, very much. I wanted every bit of story that you chose incorporated something that you had given me. Very demanding on the performer, but really rewarding as well, because you're constantly thinking ahead of, okay, I know these are the beats of the next narrative that they're going to experience. And it might be through the medium of CBT therapy with your eyes closed and modified storytelling, or it might be poetry, or it might be kind of physicality and getting them to give me bits and pieces. I'm trying to think of a way of describing it that wasn't incredibly earthy and floral, because I'm not very good at kind of expressing that way. But it was very much about how do you give me pieces of you that I can then weave into this kind of boys narrative who, very Peter Pan, can't grow up, can't get past the part of their life that they keep repeating to make themselves feel okay with getting through each day.
And you stand uniquely in sort of my circles, which is more in the puzzle experience and escape room world, where emotional interaction or emotional experiences, they're a difficult thing to get right. They involve actual like danger, much more so than physical danger, because they vary so wildly from person to person. But emotions are like when people recount experiences, it's always the emotional experience that they've had, or there's an emotional element to it. And in the world of team building, I've been made aware that if you want to change behavior, then provide emotional experiences to people. And there's no amount of bells and whistles or tech or anything that can replace an emotional experience. How would one go about designing an emotional experience with narrative?
Oh wow, that's an interesting question. Especially when you're looking at a designed experience rather than say you're looking at like a play or a more traditional narrative, like stealing from those pieces and adding it into this kind of world. I see it the most problematic in, say, learning design, where you need to have a set series of outcomes for someone, especially in the e-learning space, of they must know these things and we must know that they know these things by the time they finish. And getting them to care about it is such a battle, because you only have a set amount of time and you only have a set medium with which to do it in, which is often slow internet, dodgy graphics, and how do you turn that into an emotional experience?
Right.
So I often fall back on a lot of the kind of like, okay, there's this idea that we experience our lives through stories, through the stories we tell ourselves and through the stories that are told to us. So when you design your experience, what is the story that a person is going to be telling themselves, and what is the story that they are going to be told, and how
Yeah.
will those two come together? I think the most important part for me is emotion happens between parts. So there's this idea of intermedia, which is from like the 50s, which is if you have one experience like looking at a painting, and you have another experience which is reading a book, and the two are not related or are related, doesn't matter.
Mm.
The emotional experience happens with both, but it happens at the most powerful in the space between. I read a book about this emotional story of someone's father passing away, and then I saw this beautiful painting of an old man. It's a really different experience to I saw this beautiful painting of an old man, and then I started reading a story about someone's father passing away. Same
Absolutely.
narrative.
Yeah, yeah. And I was talking actually about this exact sort of thing with some escape room owners, and it reminds me of the birth of film editing, actually, and why film editing changed film and actually opened up the world of taking photos, 25 frames a second, and turned it into a storytelling narrative, was because we invisibly to ourselves create narrative by just two images, place them together, and we create a connection inside our own minds. And it's
Hmm.
that connection that we create that we love. Like, that's the thing that makes us go, that was such a good story. It's like, it wasn't really a story, it was a picture. It was two pictures put next to each other. The story was something that you made by trying to make sense of those two pictures. And I love it. When I was made aware of this, we were shown a person's eyeball, and then the very next frame was a razor cutting like a ball or something, like a cutting, what was it cutting, like, maybe a piece of cheese or
Hmm.
something. It was just a razor cutting something. But the two things, it wasn't a razor cutting an eyeball, but you scream because you have connected an eye with a razor cutting into something, and you feel it. You feel your body changes. You have this physical change in your body. So it's incredibly powerful to be able to do that, and yet it's not it's not a difficult thing to actually do if you have the intention and the design there.
It's a
Yeah.
Hitchcock experiment. The old man looking out a window, and then whatever you intercut with it is how you perceive the old man as kindly or creepy. It's the same expression, but if he's shown like a young lady dressing, then it shows him as kind of lecherous. And if you show then a family playing in the yard, it kind of shows him as like kind of kindly grandfather figure, depending on
Interesting.
your own perception.
So there's a lot of power there, and it's not really using much technology. The escape room owners and puzzle designers I've been speaking to recently, it seems the media is really trying to, borrow from like Sleep No More and bring these immersive theater elements in. It's still in the beta stage. If I were to give an analogy of where I at least think escape room en masse is at, it's at the Sega level of
Mhm.
of video games. And it has been, or yeah, we're just moving away from the arcades in like the arcade games of like Pong and Donkey Kong and Frogger, and we're moving into Sega, so it's a little bit more of a narrative base. But a lot of the owners are saying, the rooms that really blowing people away and experiences are ones that have a narrative, and two, where what you're doing in that narrative is what you're doing in the room is inspired by the narrative, so that there's this cohesive world that's happening, which does remind me a lot of the experience that you're currently creating. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and how it is immersive theater, but there is a sort of interactive, almost puzzle-ish design element to it, and how the tactile element is meant to help enhance the story?
Yeah, yeah. We're currently designing this, or were pre-COVID and are still on and off throughout COVID, a show called Scrap, where we were looking at how can you turn a pile of junk under an overpass into a kind of magical and wonderful experience that's about moving on from trauma. because I don't want to know whatever else everyone talks about over beers, but that's what happens when I talk to my friends.
You're the life of the party.
And I've been lucky enough to be kind of co-designing it with this roboticist and incredible immersive theater maker, as well as an incredible circus performer and kind of a performance director, and who also happens to be doing her Ph.D. in trauma. And between the three of us, we were like, okay, how can we create a space where once you sit down and the performance starts, there's still a proscenium arch there where people play with the junk and assemble it into different things. You're given the ability to be invited in to help inform how they do that. So that by offering advice at 2 or 3 points during the show, it changes the space that you end up with at the end, the hidden treasures that are in the space that you get to explore when it's done, and potentially the ending of the narrative.
Right.
So that
creating that perceived co-creation.
And the current design is only there's only 3 possible outcomes: 6 spaces which are informed by it, but 3 spaces with 3 flavors, and then 3 endings with 3 flavors. So for the performers, they only really have to remember like 6 different things, I think, because of the coalescence of that.
Right.
But for the audience, it'll be unique every time. Because even if they end up with the same space and the same show, because of their input to it, it'll slightly differ.
Right.
I don't
And
know
the
how to describe
stories
that.
they'll create between the two, the changes that they make, and they will link those changes together. You'll have an audience member who will see it at a different time than another one, and they'll have 2 vastly different stories, or quite different stories. Is that right?
Yeah, that's completely right. And we tried to play with innocuous choices as well, so that it's not as informed as like, should we go after the bad guy with the mustache?
Right.
It's more like one which we eventually scrapped, but that Tom, one of the co-designers, put together was, should I have like a bacon sandwich or some avocado on toast to begin with? And they're like, oh, we'll get some bacon. You just hear someone walk off stage, and then the sound of a pig being slaughtered, and then they come back kind of horrified and holding the bacon sandwiches. Which is,
did you watch Bandersnatch?
No, I didn't in the end. But I've heard all the reviews. I've heard it's quite interesting like that.
Yeah, it puts these. It definitely gave me feelings when Anna and I watched it, and I would be interested to see how it was made, and I was reminded of you and your process and the things that you've created as I was watching it, because there are these moments in there where you make a choice, and then later on, something similar will happen. You'll go, oh, I'll go down this seemingly innocuous path, and then the next moment you're like, oh God, oh no. And then later on, you get given a similar sort of choice, and you're almost like scared from the time before, where you're like, well, yeah, I see that there's 2 simple paths to go down here, but last time I chose a simple path, something really bad happened, and now I'm not so sure. It almost felt like that was designed in such a way that we didn't really have much choice because of the fear of being surprised and traumatized by it. You scratched that idea? You scratched the ham sandwich idea?
We did. I love horrific things as a way of exploring a medium, but I often find that they cheapen the deeper parts that you can do with a narrative.
Right.
It's kind of like in film school, every first year film student wants to put a horror together because it's the easiest one to do well for a low budget. Because with horror, the most horrific thing is not knowing what exactly has happened and filling it in with your brain.
Right.
Which is very cheap to not show. But when you go further into it, I think that the really slightly moving and deep and sorrowful moments, as well as the deep and happy moments, and the moments that people come to with themselves and start attributing more meaning than you could even, in Dinopocalypse, we had a lady scream, "I'm a vet," and try and run on stage and save one of the dinosaurs. And I had to crash tackle her off as a kind of a safety measure, because she just was too into the narrative and couldn't believe what was going on. Despite numerous people saying like it's just a play.
Right. They're not real dinosaurs.
Like it's a person in a mask and tights. Like
we didn't extract their fossil from amber. Like it's.
But it's an interesting thing of that was not a horrific moment. That was not a deeply kind of sad moment. It was just a separation moment of
Right.
sorrow for a character trying to express what had happened to them. And someone couldn't bear the grief that they themselves had obviously imparted on this. And I've learnt to put more safety into my shows since then, because clearly that was unsafe for that person to get to that point.
Right.
It's a big thing with VR design. I think it's probably the closest thing I can think of at the moment to what you're talking about with escape room design, of the safety of a person and the things that you can do to someone in a place where they hand you their decisions in their world for, half an hour to an hour to however long.
Yeah. And we sort of go to these experiences, especially theater and movies. What we're paying for is to feel an emotion of some degree, whether it's awe or fear or like or sadness or something. So we are already going into a place that's like, okay, do your thing to me. Now, we've also become extremely numb to these things because we can see through the sort of the presentation, and we can see, oh yeah, this is hack writing, or this acting is not good, or the editing is sloppy. So it is becoming increasingly difficult to trick ourselves into emoting or connecting with these emotional stories. And so I can very much see how a medium of theater that is approaching this in a bit of a new way, or in a way that people aren't so familiar with, they get surprised because they're already primed. They're already expecting to have an emotional experience, but then they're given this, like, what they're expecting is just going to be a morsel, is an entire feast. And now you're in the opposite problem that a lot of people would love to have, which is, wow, your audience is almost feeling too much, and you have to put safety measures in place so that they don't feel so much, so that they only feel like a happy amount, even if it's sadness.
Or at least to prepared.
Yeah.
They have to be, if you're going to go into like issues of assault or suicide or those sorts of things, some people need and want to experience them, and they can make incredible stories. You got to make people prepared for it. You can't just drop that on someone who, and again, it's the user's story they tell themselves. If it doesn't fit with their narrative and they're not ready to either exit or make that fit, I think that's poor design.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, it's poor in that, if you've just reminded me of who, at some point on some film set in the 80s or something, someone spiked the catering table with LSD, and like the story is, no one enjoyed that. Like, someone obviously was well-meaning and wanted everyone to, go on a trip or whatever. I thought it would be fun. No one had a good time. Like, people were freaking out. And you shoot yourself in the foot as an experienced designer if you think, oh, I'm going to make these people feel, and it's going to, like, I'm going to pull the rug out from under them. It's going to shock them. And that's what I want my audience to feel. And no, people don't come away from that being like, I'm so glad that I was really shocked by that. They think, hey, I actually could have invested. I could have been open to it. I could have been well primed and ready to go on that journey had I known that I was going to be going on that sort of journey. Just like, hey, if you're going to take someone on a trip and it's to the freaking snow, you're going to say, hey, I'm going to take you on a surprise trip, but you're going to need a jacket. They're going to love you even if they get cold. They're like, oh, I've got the jacket. But if you just take them out and say, hey, it's a surprise trip, and you didn't let them wear a jacket, then they're not going to have a good time at all.
Or at least, have two trips planned where there's a fork in the road and you can say, do you want to put a jacket on now or not?
Right.
And they might know the meaning of that. And so either you go up the mountain and go skiing, or you go down the mountain and go to a lovely restaurant or something. That's kind of exorbitant design. Design two experiences is the answer. No. But it can be a really interesting kind of self-directed illusion of choice, because both might actually be part of the end story, but when you give them that choice, they might think they made the choice that impacted it.
Yeah, right. And I think if you do see Bandersnatch, I'll be interested to hear your take on it as an experienced designer of choose your own narratives, for how they do that, and how you think there's this feeling of like, I was on the track the whole time, but I had the illusion that I was pulling the lever to go on these different ones. I think I was just on the one track. But you've brought up something that's really interesting that I think plays into like creating an emotional experience for people, is this idea of like ambiguous choice, where, it's like, do I call and break up with my girlfriend. Like, there's the situation the character's faced with, ending a relationship, and you're given the yes or no. I feel like there's more power when there's this great ambiguity, and one of them is, it's like, I know this is an important decision, but it's ambiguous. Just like, hey, we're going to go on a trip. Do you wear a coat or do you not? And it's like, oh, I don't know whether it's going to be good to wear the coat or not good to wear the coat. Shit. They don't really have much stake in the choice. Like, they don't know which path they're going to choose. They have this choice here. I feel like that is more emotionally engaging when you don't know the outcome, when you make the decision, and when it is presented as an ambiguous direction. Is that a factor when you've been creating these immersive shows, that the choices are not too on the nose? Or
it's a tricky one because it depends on the type of audience that you're designing for when that choice is most impactful. So there will be someone, if you bring the choice earlier, so the less informed the choice is, but the more impact it might have, then it's harder for people to correlate choice to outcome and to see, I made that happen. But if you make it too late, then the choice becomes really obvious. You kind of get halfway through a game, and the choice you're presented is like, do I kill all the innocent people or do I let them free because they're innocent? Less impact.
Yeah.
What becomes really interesting is if that earlier choice happens and someone is informed, then they feel superior if they're the right kind of audience. So with Dino, we had like someone would come for the second night and they'd be like, wait, I know what happens if I choose that route now in this choice. So I'm going to choose the other thing, or I'm going to choose that so that I can game the narrative. But we would always have a flag in that would go, this is the second time someone has come. So even if they make the same choices, they'll get a different experience.
Oh, cool.
So responsive design, I think, is really interesting as well there for replayability. And so that, if someone does a escape room twice, you can say, oh, wow, we've got someone that's already done it before, and you change the locks around. Not much, just enough to kind of play with that preordained narrative, because then that person's mastery tick, that little part of their brain that's telling them I'm really good at this, is satisfied that they are good enough to change the experience, and then is satisfied again by being challenged by a higher level of mastery.
Yeah, right.
It's sort of like roguelike design.
Roguelike?
So roguelikes are games where you die and your character dies and all your progress is lost, but you learn more about the world, so you go again. And so by dying over and over again, you gain more experience of what you might need to do to survive, or more items or more things. Kind of stealing from that area.
Yeah, right. And video game design it's set the model, it's set the standard for these immersive real world experiences now that we're creating, which has been a common theme in the episodes I've recorded recently, which is how fascinating it is that these things are happening after the video game revolution. And it was almost like we needed TV, or we needed this like separation medium where there's this fourth wall to, as audiences and as sort of people being entertained, we needed to be walked into this idea that we are the protagonist in a story. Because the technology of immersive theater and of escape rooms and puzzle adventures and the, what you've been designing, it's been around before video games, but they never existed. Like no one had immersive theater prior to a video game, which is fascinating.
Sorry.
No, you go.
They actually kind of did, but not in the way that we've designed. So they weren't actively designed, I guess. So you look back in like 1600s, in Commedia dell'arte, I probably butchered that, but they would have little pre-narratives that they would send in wooden carvings to villages before the comedians rocked up, that told stories of what was to come. And then the way the audience interacted with them would then inform the story that they were told on stage. And it was very much like people throwing shit at each other, and like the theater of the people has had moments of this, and pantomime has been around for forever.
Right.
But I don't think we've had an active design language until video games gave us the like, make a room in a box.
Yeah,
kind of
like. And set up a world for the viewer as well. A very like, you are here doing this thing. as opposed to the random audience spectator who may or may not throw a tomato, which may or may not influence how the show is going. It's like, you are going to influence it. In fact, you're actually going to be the prime mover of the narrative now. And oftentimes we find in escape rooms, anyone like younger audiences who have never done them before seem to understand what's going on much better than older audiences. Just because they go, there are rules here, and I'm going to find out what those rules are and then play within them. And then they do quite well. Whereas adults are just, older people just, they don't understand that what is and what isn't a part of the rule system there. This is all super fascinating, and I haven't gone into so much depth about actually like the emotional journey that you can send people on, especially with their consent. If someone was out there to want to make design experiences that involve like an emotional component specifically, do you have any advice for people looking to do that, and maybe where they should start and some things to look out for?
Yeah, definitely. First thing I would do is raid Punch Drunk's YouTube channel. They have these like behind the scenes videos of how they've designed a lot of those experiences. Especially the Lost Lending Library gave me a lot of inspiration for found things in design spaces.
Just the Lost Lending Library is a beautiful concept and beautifully delivered. Can you just give people watching or listening to this a quick rundown if they don't know of what it is? It's worth spending a minute
on. And then definitely that like there's the game design textbook. I have it here, The Art of Game Design, on my desk, and I just refer to that all the time because I love reading a passage from that and then reading a passage from a bunch of script books, whatever it might be, because there's so many out there, and comparing the two approaches for what we're trying to get out of people. And there's this if you're looking at cross media design in particular, so combining online experiences or pre and post experiences for things, there's a free PDF you can download from a guy called Robert Pratton, which is called The Beginner's Guide to Transmedia Storytelling. And it's just full of diagrams. He has just packed full all of these different ideas for how you design engaging experiences across the web and mixed with online video or physical things. He's part of a community that have like the Why So Serious guys are in, who No Mimes Media. Again, jump on No Mimes Media's website and play their game if it's still live, because they couldn't explain what they did to people, so they made a 10-minute augmented reality game. Not augmented reality in the way that we know it now, but ARG in the traditional sense of an offline adventure that you play, or that connects like pieces on websites and things in the real world.
Something I would generously like to coin as a fictional reality.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's what is the extra fabricated layer that you put on top of the real world to create that fictional reality game? I think that is a missing bit.
Those are the guys that did the campaign for The Dark Knight. Is that right? When it came out?
Yeah. Those are the guys that baked cell phones into cakes and sold them out of stores, which then gave you a code which you could put into a website to then unlock some of the Dark Knight's kind of, or the Jokers, depending on which way you went, or Harvey Dent's campaign. And like, they got over 1 million people around the world playing. They're insane.
So cool.
Yeah. And then I think the emotion and the narrative component of it, I learnt most of that by looking at people like Brie Code and the way that they rethought of game design.
Right.
I cannot stress enough the importance of an equal or a feminist approach to narrative in games, and looking at games beyond fight or flight into the deeper research that those kinds of people have brought forward of Tend or Befriend. Christy Dean is another one that I would shout out there. They're great people to look up. Like, they've got tons of YouTube stuff, tons of seminars they put online that you can listen to while you work and piece them together.
It's very cool in this, I guess I want to say this modern day, but it's a bit of a facetious term, but it's very cool to look at this more like feminine approach, which is about collaboration, which is about working together with other people. And awesome to see that there's people out there backing this up with science. And it's like, this isn't just a feeling, this is a real thing, but we respond emotionally to collaborative, cooperative environments. And when you put someone in those places and you can subvert it and play with it, you have an engaged experience. That's otherwise you just have things like Call of Duty or shoot 'em ups, and yeah, it's fight or flight, but the only emotion you have is being not the winner or not the one who shoots. Whereas there's no one's in Call of Duty being like, Ken, my character died and I'm so emotionally connected to the character of Ken.
And if they are, it's because they're like role playing with friends, or they're doing it in a tend to befriend way. I think at the other end of a giant amount of bro culture and testosterone comes a giant amount of like a collective and collaborative culture where it's like, oh, my homie's dead, I'll come back for you, Ken.
Cool. Those are some great. I've written all these down, so they'll be in the links below in the show notes if you're interested in following any of this stuff up. Heaps of free resources out there. Do your research. So this is actually can be dangerous territory if misused and misabused. What are some things to maybe what I can't think of the word. All I can think of is cooperative. It's not the right word. Caution. What are some cautionary steps people can take when developing emotional experiences?
I think the number one thing is to don't be afraid to go into deep, dark places, but always do it in a safe way where your audience is informed. So if you're just constantly asking the question, is my audience informed of the worst way that this could go? Then you'll do it in a safe way. In particular, if you're dealing with mental health or suicide or domestic and family violence situations, then allow people to opt in for informed consent. So if you're going to design a narrative that goes there, these are important stories that need to be told. If no one's talking about these things, they don't come to the light, and we don't move forward with them as a society. We don't improve in the way that we deal with them. But yeah, you can design a beautiful experience that doesn't need to be a triggering experience. And if it does need to be a triggering experience for certain people, or an experience which puts them at risk, then just allow them to give you informed consent. Yeah. If you have a blanket sheet at the beginning of an experience, particularly for people that go to multiple, that says, would you like to tell us about any of the following? Then they won't actually be able to know what's going to be in the narrative, because it makes it more formalized. And so then you're informed to be able to pull them aside if you need to, in a person-to-person or in an online space, or they're able to then have a triggered warning come up and say, yeah, this does include it.
Absolutely. You don't want to trick anyone. You don't want to pull out the rug from anyone. And if they're informed and can make that decision as someone who feels like they have enough information, then they're going to engage. Even if they are challenged and pushed into that area of discomfort, they are going to have potentially a transformative experience. Whereas in the other way, they shut off from the material, and you might even do more damage than good. And nobody wants that at all.
Yeah, you're playing with people's emotions in the end. That's what emotional design is. It's, you're designing for a certain impact and outcome for people. So you just got to be wary of that, and you're in charge. So you have to take ownership of that.
Yeah, well, and that's I think an important question. It raises an important question. If you're designing an emotional experience, or you want to give that experience to people of someone having oh my God, this is really, what a sad story, or, what a beautiful story or something. It can be interesting from the very early stages. Why are you doing that? To what end do you want to change this person's emotional state? Other than, wow, that person was a genius. What is the reason for wanting to have someone have emotional experience about a story of suicide? Is it for them to learn? Is it to spread awareness? Is it to tell someone's story and have that be retold? I think that's a really important question to answer at the beginning.
I think that's always the things we need to ask ourselves as creators, right? Why am I making this?
Yeah. And just make sure it's not to boost your own ego, because that can be dangerous and be ultimately unfulfilling. Well, Cameron, thank you so much. I just want to say, in this lighting and with that jacket, you remind me of a resistance fighter from Star Wars. Just need, the helmet with the red visor.
Yeah.
There we go. He's got to fly into the Death Star, everybody, and save the day.
Thank you, James. Thanks for putting up for me with having no vision after my laser treatments. So
Look, it's super intense, and you got lasers beamed into your eyes, so it's made you look. I will admit it, yeah, a little bit like a darkened Sith Lord sitting in his basement. But you've come out as this really like lovely, caring, emotional experience designer with a lot of wisdom and some great ideas there. So no, thank you for coming on, man. I have been using this podcast, to talk about this and spread this for whoever is interested, but it also teaches me like heaps. So it's fascinating to take all of these things into consideration when it comes to designing a story. So that's lovely. Is there anything that you would like to plug or send people who may be watching or listening this to outside of the links in the bio?
No, I'm honestly, I spend most of my life in corporate at the moment. When the show is ready for scrap, I'll plug the hell out of it. But at the moment, I think you need to go deep down the rabbit hole of the puzzle maker, because I learn a lot from James as well. So I'll give you a plug instead, because I'm knee deep in corporate. I wouldn't say filth, but wading through it at the moment.
Yeah.
So
you're doing good work out there, spreading your skills as a doctor of storytelling to the corporate world where they need it in this climate. So thank you so much. Like I said, just check those links in the bio for all of those resources about game design and user experience design, because adding an emotional element it's going to just change your design, your puzzle design, from good to amazing if you can pull it off. And people will not forget it if they are attached to the narrative and the story. So thanks once again, Cam, and we'll catch you next time.
All right, everyone, thank you. There we have our episode with Cameron Cliff. If you enjoyed anything that we talked about in that episode, specifically Cliffhanger Creative, go check out his website. Keep an eye on him. But also, more importantly, we have links in the bio for some really great stuff on the feminist approach to gaming, which I think is a fascinating look at how we can restructure storytelling, how we can restructure gameplay to incorporate a little bit more of a feminine or a bit more of a collaborative nature. Now, games like Animal Crossing and The Sims and world building and games that involve us to sort of nurture and take care of our environment where we're rewarded, these feelings actually elicit stronger emotions sometimes than anger or aggression or combat or winning. They are more about succeeding, and these skills that they're going to help develop in players, and when you see this gameplay enacted in front of you, they help you have an understanding of the world where when you collaborate and when you care and when you work with people, and that is your goal, is to de-escalate combat in ways that are going to work for both parties, you actually can build something together. And this is an approach to gameplay and narrative and experience design that I'm really excited at looking at. So go and check out those the links in the bio there. If you haven't already, remember to like, subscribe, leave us a review, tell your friends. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much.